today, I always like to quote, because he said it for as long as I can remember, President Bush says our most important bilateral relation, and he's been saying this for many decades, is U.S. China relations. And so we have an outstanding speaker on that topic today, Christopher Johnson, Senior Advisor, who holds the Friedman Chair in China Studies at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Johnson has worked as a senior China analyst at the Central Intelligence Agency for many years. Over lunch, he told me, we were talking about former President Bush, how much he admired him because he had the chance as a president, former president, and as a director of the CIA. Christopher had the chance to brief him many times on U.S. China relations. During the time he was with the CIA, he was involved with analytical support on issues ranging from the 1996 Taiwan Strait missile crisis, the 1999 accidental bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, as well as the downing of the U.S. reconnaissance aircraft on Hainan Island in 2001 and the SARS epidemic in 2013. He served as an intelligence liaison for 2 secretaries of state, their deputies on worldwide security issues, and in 2011 he was awarded the U.S. Department of State's Superior Honor Award for outstanding support to the Secretary of State. So please join me now in welcoming Chris Johnson. Christopher.
Thank you very much, Charles. Appreciate that kind introduction, and good to see everyone here. I want to thank the Society for giving me this opportunity to come down here and enjoy your beautiful facility. Very, very impressive place. And I want to thank ConocoPhillips, of course, for recommending that I come down and be the speaker. My general approach, I'm not an academic. I spent most of my time in government, so I like a free-flowing conversation. So I'm going to try to keep my formal remarks relatively brief and get the audience engaged in Q&A. I always find that to be the most interesting thing. And then, of course, I'd also especially just like to thank Thomas Riley here at the Asia Society for doing all the fantastic logistical work that got me here. We had some challenges with scheduling and so on, and we run a lot of events at CSIS, and I know how logistics so often kills you in terms of being able to get something done right. So I really appreciate his assistance. Today we've got a pretty wide topic that we're looking at, sort of China's reform program under its new leadership and what it may mean for Sino-U.S. relations. And so what I'd like to do in the opening remarks is just to sort of walk you through an understanding of how to think about the new leadership team that was put in place in the fall of 2012 at the 18th Party Congress, and especially the new president, Xi Jinping, and how he is different in so many ways from his predecessor, Hu Jintao, and what that means not only for domestic society in China, but also for the way he handles their foreign relationships. And then we'll talk a little bit about the economic reform program that was put in place last fall at the now famous third plenum, and where we think that's all going, what the forces behind it are, the difficulties that the leadership may face in trying to do these very challenging reforms, and what it means for the U.S. China economic and trade relationship, because I think it has very major implications for that. And then we'll talk a little bit about the new leadership's foreign policy strategy and what appears to be a very different foreign policy approach than the previous leadership, or perhaps any previous leadership in some time. And especially what that means for some of these territorial issues that we've been reading a lot about in the papers lately, and how that affects Sino-U.S. relations. So we'll try to cram all that into about 20 or 25 minutes, maybe half an hour, and then we'll open the floor to questions and answers. On the first part about Xi Jinping, I think the thing to stress is that we had a very smooth and stable succession in the fall of 2012. Another one, the one from Jiang Zemin to Hu Jintao in 2002 was very smooth, and this one was smooth as well. And I think you can argue that there was really no reason that necessarily that process should have been smooth. They faced a lot of serious challenges. There was the collapse of a former Politburo member whose family members decided it was okay to go around murdering foreign citizens. They had a lot of pressures that they were facing during the run-up to the succession period. And also, this was the first transition that the serving leaders were trying to push through without the hand of these old retired elders, the people who had revolutionary credentials from the Civil War period. So this was the first succession that really didn't have the hand of Deng Xiaoping, the former patriarch. His imprint was not on this. And so there was a lot of disputing, really, within the top leadership over who should be calling the tune about how to align the new leadership. And it really went down to the very wire. In fact, they had wanted to have the party congress much earlier in the October timeframe, and it wound up being delayed to November. So I think this is very significant that they managed to get through the process smoothly despite all of those challenges that they faced. Secondly, I think it's important to emphasize that Xi Jinping is surrounded by a very capable technocratic group of officials, especially in the financial sector, in the sort of Ministry of Finance sector, all across the government. These are people with longstanding credentials, looking at and doing what they've been doing in their foreign ministry as well. You have had a return of career diplomats into the senior positions in the foreign ministry, and also the person who oversees their broad foreign policy portfolio. And they're very experienced, not only in dealing with Sino-U.S. relations, but also in dealing with relations with the regional neighbors, Southeast Asia, and even Japan. So a very sort of competent and technocratic group of people. And I think they're going to need all of this ability to be able to manage this very difficult transition that they're going through, both domestically and abroad. And the main question really is, what type of China does China want to be? And how are they going to comport themselves internationally? And this is something I think, frankly, that the leadership is still working their way through as they've come into power. Obviously, we've read and seen a lot about China's rise as a great power and returning to a state of, very, very important position globally. And there's been a substantial debate inside not only Chinese society, but also in the elites in China about what that means and what sort of status they should be claiming, as this rising power. And so I think that's something that we all have to watch very carefully. A few words about Xi Jinping as an individual. In my assessment, you probably read a lot about how quickly he's managed to consolidate power. He's only been in office not even for 2 years, and I think the general assessment, and I think it's right, is that he's kind of already gotten to where his predecessor Hu Jintao did in 10 years. Some would argue he never fully consolidated power. Xi Jinping has already well eclipsed where Hu Jintao managed to get. And even his predecessor, Jiang Zemin, Xi Jinping is kind of on a par with him. So how was he able to move so quickly? This is something that I think surprised a lot of observers. I personally wasn't that surprised because I've been watching him for a long time and knew him to be a very capable individual, having met him a few times. But I think there's 3 keys to understanding how quickly he's managed to move. The first is this so-called princeling background, right? The person who is a son of one of the founders of the regime. And there's a whole network, of course, of these people across the entire system. And they sit in all of the key areas in the government, in the military, in the party bureaucracy. And so what this has done for Xi Jinping is it has given him a built-in personal network. And as we all know, personal relationships in China are extremely important to being able to influence and wield power. And so unlike Hu Jintao, who was kind of plopped on top of the leadership and then had to go about building a network of people, Xi Jinping already has had this in place from the minute he showed up. And in fact, the folks I talked to in Beijing emphasize that he has used those relationships even when he was the understudy as vice president to start thinking about the policy changes that he might like to make and so on. And so that's how, in the course of just a year, you have him, doing very well in terms of consolidating his political position, and then also rolling out this very ambitious reform package that not only touches on economics, but also touches on military reform, judicial reform, societal reform. I mean, it's very comprehensive, certainly the most comprehensive reform package that's been out there since the 1980s. So that first piece is just this sort of princeling background. And that really gives him also, I think, a very unique understanding of how power operates inside that system. As one Chinese friend has told me, you know, imagine what it was like for him sitting around the dinner table every evening, listening to his father talk about what Mao Zedong was doing in terms of how he was punishing his enemies and you know, wielding power. A very clear lesson for the young Xi Jinping in how to sort of manage that system. And the way he's been moving since he's come into power, I think, very much tells us that. You know, a heavy emphasis on the party as the key institution. You know, Bill Clinton said it was the economy stupid. Xi Jinping's view is it's the party stupid in terms of how he runs Chinese society. And we've seen the party very much come back to the forefront. And then secondly, I think it also, though, his personal experience leaves him somewhat wary of that system. You know, he was there watching his father go from a very senior position to being purged during the Cultural Revolution, Xi himself having to go down and work at a very agrarian, basic level, you know, inside the system for a very long time. And so he also understands the limits of operating in a system with no rules. And I think that's very important to what we've seen him doing in terms of how he's developing his approach to running the place. So that's kind of the first piece, this princeling background. I think the second piece is, because of that background, he has this sort of natural understanding that in a Leninist system like China's, you need to be able to have control of the key levers of power if you want to wield authority. And this is something that his predecessor, Hu Jintao, was really never able to do effectively. I think he understood that same lesson, but he simply was prevented by others in the system from being able to do so. So it shouldn't surprise us that we've seen Xi Jinping move very rapidly on anti-corruption, especially in the military, right, a key constituency, in the party bureaucracy, and in the security services. Those really are the keys to the kingdom in terms of being able to run the system effectively. He's also understood that there's a lot of stovepiping inside that system, right? Over time, you've had a very stovepipe Leninist system develop that's riding on a very dynamic society. It's a bad combination. And so what we've seen him do is to create several new leading groups. These are bodies that the senior leaders sit on to try to do a better job of coordinating. And he's doing this in the foreign policy space to try to have a smoother foreign policy approach, and then also with regard to these reforms. So he's really the first leader in many, many decades to create brand new superstructures, if you will, inside the system to manage the many challenges that they're facing. And that says a lot about his power. And then I think the third kind of key to understanding how quickly he's been able to move is this issue of he's developed basically a fairly coercive toolkit to be able to deal with opponents, you know, inside the system who aren't on board with the reform package that he's trying to push through. And we see this most deliberately in terms of anti-corruption inside the system. So we see pretty much every day some new senior official is being detained or removed from office. He is taking an approach that really is bending or putting under very serious strain some long-standing, not rules, but norms that were put in place by Deng Xiaoping after the Cultural Revolution. One of which was you don't go after families. You know, having Deng Xiaoping having had his own son chased by Red Guards and jumped out a window to save his life, and then was in a wheelchair for the rest of his life, still is, put that kind of norm into place. And the second was, if you make it safely into retirement, all sins are forgiven with regard to corruption and things like this, right? And this is clearly no longer the case under the Xi Jinping administration. So we have a former Politburo Standing Committee member, this highest level, that's being looked at very seriously. And that will break the sound barrier inside their system with regard to, you know, bringing down someone who formerly was at the very top of the system. And of course, this means that if you're any other former Politburo Standing Committee member in that system, you're a lot more nervous about your position, your children's position, and so on than you would have been prior to now. So that's very important. The second piece is something that has, unfortunately, sort of just, you know, just the communist jargon of it makes it difficult, but it's this mass line education campaign, okay, that they've been going through. And this is really a return to Mao-style campaigns. And Xi Jinping is very serious about this, and he's really quite a bit more ideological, I think, than his predecessor. And I say that in a very value-neutral sense. I mean, this is something that's very difficult to try to get this story out in Washington, because when you say ideological, then people think, oh my gosh, he's a hardline communist, which is not the case at all. but he is a Marxist, and as such, he believes in kind of the party's leading role. And so what he's got is all these officials across the system going through this process, writing these self-criticisms against each other, you know, and so on. And it's difficult for officials who are involved in it, and it's seen as very pervasive. You know, they just, in fact, extended this campaign. It was supposed to end in June, and now it's running through at least September. So that tells you something about the way he sees it as a tool. And then I think the third area is the ideological sort of tightening that we've seen across the system. Pretty much every day there's a story about some new person who's being detained, or that the internet is being blocked, or microbloggers are being put under pressure, and so on. And I think it's because Xi Jinping understands intuitively that the reform process that he's trying to push through is going to be very difficult. And so they really just don't want any deviation to the left or to the right in terms of where the party is on this. And so it's a very, very pervasive crackdown ideologically. And so one question that intrigues me, and something we're looking at very carefully in our research at CSIS, is, you know, can you be successful in pushing this reform program using such a heavily coercive toolkit? You know, coercion works, but it doesn't always motivate people particularly well. So this is something that we're watching to see how this morphs going forward. So let's shift over to the economic reform program and discuss that for a little bit. I think the key point to make here is this is the most comprehensive package of reforms that has been done inside the system in many, many years, certainly decades. It's as if Xi Jinping and his colleagues made a laundry list, basically, of everything that should have been done by the previous generation of leaders that wasn't. And so it goes across the entire system. And it really is a fundamental mindset shift for the Chinese system and for Chinese leaders. I mean, if we believe, and I think we should, what they say, that the most sort of important breakthrough, if you will, of the plenum last fall was this idea that they want to create a decisive role for the market in shaping their economy. Obviously, that has massive consequences for not only state-owned enterprises, but just the general nature of how the economy gets set. And they're talking about marketization of pricing, especially industrial input pricing, energy, most specifically, but other things as well. Opening up the financial sector, opening up all kinds of new areas that previously were closed, especially in these strategic industries, right? So energy, rail transportation, telecommunications, all of these areas. And depending on how you look at it, you know, the timeline they've set for themselves is 2020. That might seem far away, but when you think about the ambitiousness of what they're trying to accomplish, to me it's actually very, very close. And I think Xi Jinping has done this very, very deliberately to try to keep the pressure inside the system as high as he can. He's trying to create a sense of tension, basically, to push through these very difficult reforms. And I think what we've seen just since the plenum last fall is that it's even more difficult than he might have anticipated. You'll read constantly about the so-called vested interests. I personally think it's an overused term, but they definitely are huge vested interests inside that system. You know, when Deng Xiaoping launched the reform program in the 1980s, once he was able to sweep aside the remnant Maoists, which really didn't take him that much, there wasn't a whole lot of opposition because the country was in shambles coming out of the Cultural Revolution, and they knew that they were destroyed, basically, if they didn't make a change. In this instance, you have real people inside the system who will lose real money if they go through with these reforms, lots of money. And so there's been some kind of quiet pushback, and this is why Xi Jinping has had to create these new structures to be able to try to overcome this opposition from inside the system. And so especially, for example, in the financial services sector, where they talked an awful lot about liberalization prior to the plenum, basically when the central bank last summer organized this sort of credit crunch through the plenum, there was lots of talk about what they were going to do in the financial sector in terms of opening up the system. And really, since then, they haven't accomplished very much. We have the Shanghai Free Trade Zone. It's supposed to do a lot of things, but most of the folks that I speak to, there's very few people who can explain to you what they can do inside the zone that they can't do 2 kilometers outside the zone. I mean, this has been the real challenge. And the Shanghai municipal government is doing a fantastic job of trying their best to open this opportunity to foreign businesses, but there's a lot of resistance from inside the system. So these are the tensions, really, that that Xi Jinping is trying to grapple with. And I think on the economic reforms, there's really three main areas to keep an eye on. The first one is state-owned enterprises. Obviously, that's the big banana inside their system with regard to their ability to open up the economy and allow the market to play this decisive role. To be fair, my own view is that they've been much more aggressive on this front than I think most people would have expected. My own view is that most folks expected they wouldn't announce anything about state-owned enterprise reform in the plenum document. And in fact, if you read it carefully, there's quite a bit in there about how to deal with this. And they understand fundamentally that the state-owned enterprises, which really are the kind of chief storehouses, if you will, of overcapacity and lots of corporate debt, a ton of corporate debt inside the system, have to be reformed. And the main way they seem to want to do that is to open it up to more private sector investment. This is probably going to be Chinese private sector investment, domestic private sector investment first, but ultimately, they say anyway, they will allow foreign capital to come in. And this is certainly very important for businesses because anytime you go through this kind of a major disjuncture, there's going to be a resorting inside the system of winners and losers. And so understanding who the winners are going to be, the people that you would like to joint venture partner with, is going to be very, very important. And they haven't sorted that process out internally, so that's a big deal. The second thing to keep an eye on is fiscal reform. They have a massive problem inside their system with regard to the financial relationship between the center and the provinces and the localities. The localities have been kind of the key, ground zero for all of this debt burden that's been building up inside the system. And they have real strains on their ability to generate revenue. The chief way they do it now is by selling rural land, peasants' land, and sort of how it works is they are able to move the land to market. They pay the farmers a very small severance, basically, and then they keep the balance. And that's what helps keep the local governments functioning. And unfortunately, at the plenum, the leadership signaled that they are going to kind of take away or put pressure on a lot of these sources of local revenue. So they've talked about major changes to that land policy because it creates social tensions, right? When they sell off this land, people feel that they've been cheated. It causes a lot of disruptions locally. They've also talked about limiting the access to capital for these so-called local government finance vehicles, which are basically opaque piggy banks for the local officialdom to be able to generate a lot of revenue to be able to finance what they want to do with infrastructure projects and so on. And at the same time, the center has said, but we feel the current fiscal balance between the center and the localities is about right. So they're basically telling the localities, you're going to lose revenue, and we're not going to give you any more from the center. So this is a real challenge. And just recently, over the last month or two, there have been a lot of indicators that they are thinking seriously about changing the way they do transfer payments from the centers to the localities. And that's going to be very, very important. They have to get this right in order to be able to move away from this very heavy export-led economy toward a more balanced, consumer-driven economy. It's going to be very, very important. Then I think the third space to watch, we've talked about it a little bit, is financial sector reform. If they're going to seriously do what they want to do with this reform program, they have to open up the capital account. They have to make the Chinese renminbi a more convertible currency over time. They have to free deposit rates. There's just a ton of things that they have to do. But the challenge, of course, is that the big four state banks don't really want to see this happen because at this stage anyway, they're sheltered, right? They're prevented from having to compete with outside competition. And they know that they probably can't compete with that outside competition with a HSBC or a JP Morgan or banks like that. So this is going to be a very challenging space. The guy who's the head of the People's Bank of China, Zhou Xiaochuan, who was retained beyond the retirement age solely to accomplish this purpose, he's a very reform-oriented person. But there's a lot of other people inside the system and the banking regulator and elsewhere that don't want to see him succeed. So that's going to be a real knife fight as well going forward. So that's kind of a preview of the economic reforms. What does this mean for the U.S. China relationship, kind of their approach internationally? I mentioned earlier that I wasn't that surprised at how quickly Xi Jinping has moved domestically to consolidate his power. The one thing that has surprised me is how he's moved internationally. I would have thought, having watched these guys for a very long time, that if you were that focused and we were trying to do that much wrenching change inside, that you would want a very stable external environment. And they've talked a lot about this. They had, in fact, a major conference where the very top leaders last fall in October went, and they talked about having a good relationship with the regional neighbors. But yet we've seen some activity that has caused a lot of people to question exactly what they're up to, in the South China Sea and in the East China Sea in particular, these island disputes that we often see referenced. And it's hard for people to balance in their own mind, how do you do both of those things at once? How do you pursue better relations with the neighbors at the same time you're perceived by some anyway as stirring up trouble? And I think there's a series of reasons that explain it. One is that Xi Jinping, I think, represents a new generation of leaders. They're much more self-confident. They're much more aware of what they perceive to be Beijing's position on the world stage. I think we've seen that since the global financial crisis in 2008, we've had kind of a sine curve, if you will, in their approach to foreign relations. Right after the financial crisis, there was a lot of hubris, basically. I mean, a feeling that China had discovered some sort of a third way, with their economy. The major industrial and Western economies were in decline, if not permanent decline, and China was rising. I think it's fair to say that since then, certainly in the U.S. with the advent of shale gas and oil revolution, these sort of things, they're not quite as confident about the balance as they were in that post-global financial crisis period. And I also think as they begin to realize that these reforms are much more daunting and much more challenging than they might have initially expected, it's also kind of caused some of the air to come out of that balloon. But it's very clear to me that Xi Jinping is very determined to sort of very forthrightly protect what they claim as Chinese sovereignty in these areas. And it is stirring a lot of tension in the region, but I think there's a lot of, I'm just back from Beijing last week, and what I heard there in terms of how to understand the relationship with the Vietnam, this oil rig, right, that went down to Vietnam into these disputed territories and so on. There's just a sense that it is Chinese territory. They think they'll get away with it because they think the U.S. is distracted. Worst case, I think a lot of people in the leadership feel President Obama is just weak, not in control of his own system. You hear these things a lot when you're in Beijing these days. And so they're pushing the envelope. I think there's two kind of schools of thought as to how to think about how durable this is going to be. One school says that this is all part of Xi Jinping's process of consolidating power. He has to do this to kind of keep the hardliners, if you will, inside the system in line, and that over time he will turn to a different tack and go back to the more sort of friendly approach with the neighbors. I'm not so sure that's right. I mean, my own view is that Xi Jinping is very much in control of the system and the hardliners inside it. So I don't think he really has to, placate them in any major way. I think we need to understand that he's a different leader and is taking a very different approach. We see this, for example, in the relationship with Russia, right, where President Putin just came to Shanghai for a major summit with President Xi. They signed this gas deal that had been being bantied about for a decade, I think. And interestingly, if you look at the terms of that oil or the gas deal very, very carefully, the Chinese, even though they very much had the Russians over a barrel with regard to price, no pun intended, they ended up giving kind of a political concession on the price. They allowed the Russians to be able to use the same formula that they use with the Europeans, which is to create a formula on price that's tied to the price of oil. The Chinese, of course, did not want to do this. They just wanted to have a straight deal on gas. So there's something in that Russia-China relationship, and I think a lot of it has to do with the personal relationship between President Xi and Putin. In a lot of ways, they kind of see themselves in the other, very decisive people who are in control of their system, who do what they say. There's just this sort of mentality. That's not to suggest that the Chinese are going to form an alliance with the Russians or something like that. They're very aware of the limitations of the Russia-China relationship. But I think what they're trying to do with this approach is to maintain what you might call an active Russia card, if you will, underneath the umbrella of managing U.S. China relations. And I've had some fairly senior Chinese tell me that if the U.S. is foolish enough to allow them to do that, then that's our fault, not their fault for pursuing the relationship with Russia. And we're seeing them, I think, look more multi-directionally in their foreign policy approach than they have in the past. They very much see the Russians as a new outlet for sort of cooperation on the security and defense side, the Europeans for an area of cooperation on the economic side. It's far more easy for Chinese firms to invest in Europe than it is here in the U.S. And so we're seeing a lot of this kind of activity. Some of this, I think, is just natural. I mean, they're a rising global power, and of course they should have a more multifaceted foreign policy approach. But when you look at what they're doing, for example, in Central Asia with a lot of the stands where President Xi visited last fall, signed all kinds of gas deals and so on, they're really trying to reinforce their periphery and to sort of establish a whole new series of relationships with these countries. And it's something that the U.S. side needs to watch very carefully. And I think the main difference is with Xi Jinping is that whereas his predecessors probably spent 85 to 90% of their foreign policy energy and bandwidth on managing U.S. China relations, President Xi doesn't feel that way. You know, his view is he, of course, wants a fantastic relationship with the U.S. He understands the primacy of U.S. China relations globally and for China, as we saw during the Sunnylands meeting out in California between our two presidents. But he's not as solicitous or desirous of the relationship as his predecessors have been. And again, I think that's value neutral. It's neither good or bad. It's just how it is. And so in Washington, we need to think about, the administration needs to think about how to manage that sort of style. And I think this is a very fundamental point. The relationship is changing significantly over time. And I think that we're seeing right now with a lot of the areas of friction between our two sides, that the Chinese just aren't responding to the traditional messaging and cueing from the U.S. government in the way that we might like. And I think that's just reality. Again, I don't think it's good or bad. So it seems to me that our side needs to maybe do a fundamental reassessment about how we're going to manage the relationship going forward and how to think about what this all means for the relationship going into the future. We are in a bit of a bumpy period right now. There's a lot of tensions over cyber espionage, for example, these territorial disputes and so on. My own view is it's very easily resolved with good leadership on both sides. And we have the strategic and economic dialogue session coming up in Beijing here in another week or so, I think. And I'm hopeful that we'll see some breakthroughs. One area where I think we need to do a lot more work is in the economic and trade relationship. It's been very interesting to watch. In this plenum document, which was very focused on domestic issues. I mean, these Communist Party plenums are basically the leadership's policy planning conclave for domestic issues every year. But very prominent attention was given to a bilateral investment treaty inside this document. And, speaking to senior Chinese, they say, look, we didn't mention the United States directly, but it's very obvious who we meant by putting that in. And they highlight that President Xi and his premier, Li Keqiang, took a serious political risk domestically in mentioning this in the plenum document, because there's plenty of people, these vested interests we were talking about earlier, who don't want to see a bilateral investment treaty because it will cause all sorts of changes to the way they manage things, open up a bunch of sectors, this sort of thing. So the Chinese view, and I think there's some reason to be sympathetic with this, is that the U.S. side isn't responding to the degree that they would like. I mean, here are the two biggest economies in the world, and in terms of our USTR, Mike Froman's trade priorities, the bilateral investment treaty wasn't even on the list when he gave a speech recently publicly. We talked about the Trans-Pacific Partnership and TTIP, two very important trade agreements, of course. But the Chinese are sort of wondering where they fit, in this whole mix. Likewise, I think the real challenge going forward for us on both sides is how are we going to manage investment in the other country? This really is the key issue going forward. Chinese have a lot of money to be able to invest. They can no longer invest it domestically because of the problem that's occurring with debt from hyperinvestment. They need to put it somewhere else. And right now, they're perceived anyway to be too many restrictions. And it is the economic relationship really between our two countries that prevents us from tipping over into some kind of Cold War style relationship. President Xi, when he was here as vice president in 2012, talked about this. I think he called it the ballast and the propeller of the relationship. I use a different term, I say shock absorber, but the idea is the same, which is that it is that economic interdependence that allows us to avoid tipping over into conflict, and I think that's very, very important. So we need to get ourselves going. Another thing, likewise, is this Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. It's stalled right now. having a lot of difficulty in our Congress. There really hasn't been a real movement from the administration in terms of building a legislative strategy with the Congress in terms of how to understand moving this thing forward. And it's hurting us in the region. In Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia, economics is security for them primarily. They think about that first. And so if you're not demonstrating that you're going to be a long-term player on trade, that's going to hurt you in terms of the relationship. And the Chinese sometimes will say this is where they think they can be more assertive or more forthright in the region with what they're doing with these territorial claims, because the kind of sucking sound, if you will, of their economic rise is so powerful, and there's not a real balancer from anywhere else, especially the United States. So we have to do our homework, I think, on this to think about how that will also serve to stabilize the Sino-U.S. relationship. So why don't I go ahead and stop there? That's a lot of talking, and let people ask questions, and I'm happy to take as many as we have time for.
Thank you very much for your talk. I wanted to ask you if, in your view, was it a mistake for China to engage in this long-term gas purchase program with Russia when China possesses some of the world's greatest shale gas reserves?
Exactly. Yeah. I don't know whether it's a long-term mistake. I mean, there's a lot of debate right now about who's going to get hurt more by this, the Russians or the Chinese, right? And they're both kind of battling for who's going to be the loser, if you will, in the deal. The problem with their shale oil and gas deposits right now is that something like 85-ish% of the key acreage is owned by the China National Petroleum Corporation. They took advantage of the leasing process to kind of corner the market, if you will, on the key shale oil and gas reserves in China. And they're not doing anything with it until they believe that they are able to set sort of a monopolistic price on gas. This is why you see so much activity on the anti-corruption front right now in that sector, right? So half of CNPC half of their C-suite has been hauled away, under this corruption program over the last year. So they're under tremendous pressure. The leadership is very, very clearly signaling. Xi Jinping just gave a major speech on energy here within the last week or so, in which he highlighted that natural gas is the future. There's no doubt about it. They need it because the coal is too dirty. I mean, they got abundant supply of coal, but they're having massive environmental problems. And this is something I probably should have mentioned up front. This really is becoming a social stability issue for them now, the air pollution. Every year they have their National People's Congress, which is kind of their legislative session. The party runs the show, so it's not really a sort of decider organization. But it is an opportunity for the leadership to sit down with provincial representatives from all across the country and kind of get some feedback about how things are going. And my understanding is from every provincial delegation this year, this issue of air pollution, was number one. And it was portrayed to the leadership as, this is not only a concern among the common people, this is a concern among the urban rising elite that we are trying to keep on side, if you will, in terms of supporting the Communist Party. And so it's moved this up the ladder of their priorities. I mean, Li Keqiang, the premier, in his government work report said, I think he said he was declaring war on the environment. They don't tend to use these kind of phrases lightly because they know they're going to be held accountable for this sort of thing. I mean, the big deal for them really, they have a lot of problems underground in terms of accessing, the shale and so on, but they have even more problems above ground with regard to pipeline infrastructure, how you move it, from the west, where most of it is, into the eastern cities, and also how you handle interprovincial boundary, barriers to trade. There's a lot of cross-provincial taxes and so on that get involved. So they need a massive reorganization of their system. And this is an area that I'm watching very carefully. What role are they going to allow these private sector players to play? Some of them, like Guanghui, for example, are doing a lot of work in this area. They've demonstrated a capability to move gas from fields they control in Xinjiang up in the northwest down to Shenzhen, the kind of manufacturing center, at, I believe, 50% below the price of diesel. This is something CNPC does not want to see, right? And so they've been putting a lot of pressure on Guanghui. And in fact, Guanghui has decided that they're largely going to come over and play here and learn the skills, that they need from that. And when the environment seems more conducive to them back there, they'll go back. So it's a very interesting issue, but great question. Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit about the upcoming APEC? What kind of policies or end results do you expect to come from that meeting in October?
Yeah.
November.
We don't know yet. They're just sort of getting started. And in fact, when I was there last week and asking them, what's the main theme going to be? They're still kind of figuring out exactly what they want it to be. I think one of the main issues is food safety and security is going to be a huge priority for them. The leadership has made it a big priority coming out of their Central Economic Works Conference last December. So for U.S. firms that are operating in that space, whether it's food or medical, pharmaceuticals, milk powder, all of these sort of industries, there's a lot of opportunity there to kind of align with the government's priorities. I think energy is going to be an area, but they haven't quite sorted out, I don't think, exactly what they want to emphasize, and then, follow on from that, what opportunities there may be for companies. They have expressed some disappointment, I think, that the U.S. actually isn't giving them sort of more suggestions about how to deal with this, but they're the host, so they kind of have to come up with the agenda on their own. I would expect that once we get past the S&ED here in a couple of weeks, which does suck up a lot of bandwidth in both systems, we'll start to see the agenda, shape itself rather directly. But it's a bit late, really. I mean, when they hosted last time in 2002, I think it was, or 2001 in Shanghai, they had an agenda fully baked, well in advance. So I think a part of the deal is they're also going through these challenges with their with the reform program and everything else. They just haven't put a lot of focus on it. But I would expect that to really increase as we get past. Don't forget, we have to get past their summer political season as well, and this anti-corruption stuff is sucking up a lot of energy on that front as well right now. But I think we'll see a much clearer picture once we get into the early fall.
Because you are long-time researching on China, I would like to ask, the questions like 10 years ago, people talked about, the economic growth of China. If it decrease to like 7%, 8%, there will be a social unrest because of the huge unemployment of youth. But apparently it's not happening.
Yeah.
But in the future, because of this huge downward pressure for economic growth, because of this one-child policy and working population, it's going to maybe decrease. So how do you see the future of Chinese social stability?
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is a huge issue. I personally am fairly bullish on the government's ability to be able to manage the downward, pressure on GDP growth. The reality is that if it's good growth, my own view is that they could manage 5.5% even or 6% growth very, very sustainably. I mean, I spent years when I was in government, trying to fight against this idea that if they ever went below 8% GDP growth, they were finished. There would be massive, unrest. Well, they've been below 8% now for several years, and it hasn't happened. If there is going to be social instability, it's from issues, I think, that largely don't relate to the GDP number. So it's all about how they manage, the growth. If, however, they continue to prime the pump, with this investment spending and so on, they may very well create circumstances that would cause social instability. I mean, just in a few very isolated instances where they've allowed some of these trust products and so on to default, there have been bank runs. They've been all localized, but they still have been bank runs. And, the People's Bank has injected huge amounts of liquidity into the system to balance that. So I think going forward, we're just going to have to watch and see, how they tackle this. To me, it was a bad signal to set the target at 7.5 this year. It's too high. They know it's too high. I think if the reform folks had it their way, there wouldn't have even been a growth target. I mean, that's how you really send a signal that things are changing, right? So let's see what they do. The one thing you can be sure of is they will meet 7.5%. That's assured. And then what do they do next year, with the GDP number? They may have been too skittish this year or just too complicated with all the other things going on to be able to do that. What's interesting about how they're approaching the situation now is that they've been using very targeted stimulus, right? So not a massive stimulus campaign like we saw after the global financial crisis, but very, very targeted. And they call it all sorts of different things to avoid using the term stimulus, but it's still stimulus. And so the question is, will the stimulus going forward be good stimulus or bad? You know, there's still a lot of talk about much more rail infrastructure, much more road infrastructure. These are all necessary things, but how that's managed in terms of the way that it's handled and the corruption and, you know, everything else that's involved in the way this thing get done, how much GDP bounce are they getting for each dollar? You know, there's an interesting study, I think it was done by McKinsey here recently, where they compared that very issue. I think if you go back to sort of 2004, 5, 6, 7, you know, in that area, they were getting, for every dollar spent, they were getting about 85 cents or so in return to the GDP number. Come around post-global financial crisis, 2011-12, it was $4 in for 1 out. So clearly the ratio has really moved in the wrong direction. So we're going to have to watch and see. You know, talking to very senior folks there in the system who are working on these issues, they're not sure they've made the right move with the growth target, right? You know, I think in my time watching the situation, I don't think there's ever been a greater disconnect between where the government is going and kind of what they're assessing internally and where the consensus of outside market and other opinion is. You know, most outsiders say leverage is the main problem. You have to attack the debt, and to do that you have to lower GDP growth, you know, targets substantially, and the government hasn't done that. So I think what they're saying in response, which makes sense, is that they're targeting the structural problems in the economy, right? Financial sector, fiscal sector, these issues. They say the debt is a symptom of that disease. And the question is, can they move fast enough to do those serious structural changes over the objections of these vested interests before the ticking time bomb of that debt blows up? I mean, that really is the fundamental question. Yeah.
I have a question regarding the Shanghai free economic zone. What do you see the difference between the Shanghai free economic zone compared with the previous 4 special economic zones created by Deng Xiaoping?
Right, Shenzhen and so on. Yeah, sure. The main difference is this is about services, not about manufacturing, right? So the main goal of the Shanghai Free Trade Zone is to open the service sector, logistics, you know, all these banking, finance, all these areas, intellectual property, the internet. There's all sorts of stuff that's been talked about. I think, you know, this is an interesting laboratory for understanding where they're going. I mean, you know, it's important to underscore, I think, that Xi Jinping, when he made his sort of explanation to the Central Committee of why they're moving ahead with these reforms, he endorsed very, very clearly the Shanghai Free Trade Zone, and he said it is a test bed for national exploitation. We're going to take lessons that we're learning from the Free Trade Zone and bring them out nationally. I think one of the problems that we've seen is that the leadership seemed to believe that they could create a structure whereby the Free Trade Zone, so the Shanghai municipal officials would report directly to the State Council, right, skipping the ministries. Well, the ministries have decided they don't think so, and have pushed back very, very hard. CBRC, the China Banking Regulatory Commission in particular, but there's a lot of others. And so we've seen then Shanghai, interestingly, kind of do its own thing, like they released their own instructions on what they're going to do with financial sector reform in the Free Trade Zone. It's not clear to me they're going to be able to implement those. So I think we have to watch this space really carefully. I also think we need to give them some slack, you know, and be patient. You know, this is a very fundamental mindset shift for them. So when they release a negative list that we would all say is way too long, right? I mean, the concept of a negative list is it's supposed to be short, right? Theirs is 60 pages or something like that. And they're going to slowly cut back the number of things that are on the negative list. So I think we need to give them some time and see how it develops. But the main difference is services. And I think the challenge is, you know, they've got this very small piece of territory in which they're trying to do all this stuff. I would argue that most of the people who are in the zone already, they're in not for the market-oriented element of it, but because they want to signal the government that they're, you know, in line with the priorities and so on. So you see a lot of Southeast Asian and other Asian banks, for example, operating there, whereas the main Western banks really haven't. It's not because they're getting any special privileges. They just want to demonstrate, that they're supportive of what the government's trying to do. So I think we have to watch that space very, very carefully. But, look, they understand fundamentally that the key way you get to that consumer-driven economy is to radically expand services. And they know they need help in terms of how to, do that because they've never done it before.
So you alluded to
Can you wait for the mic? Sorry, you just wait for the mic.
What are some possible causes of social unrest you alluded to a few minutes ago?
I think there's several that the government needs to watch very carefully. One is air pollution, like I said. I think another is the proliferation of cheap smartphone technology across the country. This is a real challenge for the leadership. So unlike before, where something that was going on in the far west of China, nobody in the eastern coastal cities would have any idea, right? They have information control. They're very good at it. Now someone takes a photograph of that person, being beat up or a demonstration or whatever might be going on and puts it on Weibo, their version of Twitter, right? And then folks who are in Shanghai can see this. We haven't seen a whole lot of this, but there have been a few instances. And traditionally, the way the leadership thinks about the social instability problem is that they don't like to see two things. One is cross-sectoral demonstrations, so students and workers, or workers and peasants, or this work, coming together. The other is things that cross provincial boundaries. That's always a big no-no. These are the big lessons coming out of the Tiananmen crackdown in 1989. And this technology facilitates a lot of that. So it's something that they're going to have to watch very, very carefully. They're conflicted because on the one hand, they know they need to go this road for the economy. They have to be able to do this if they want to be innovative and all the things that they've been emphasizing. But on the other hand, they have an instinct to control. And so what you have is a massive bureaucracy that's now grown up, managing the internet, in all of this space, and taking this stuff down when it gets posted, as quickly as they can, and so on. You seem to have an eager follow-up.
It seems that their ability to control and suppress knowledge of the Tiananmen event was remarkable. They had to be incredibly efficient at tamping down social unrest. So it seems to me that kind of makes it hard to assess how much really might potentially develop.
Yeah.
It's so well suppressed.
True, but again, those vehicles that exist now didn't exist then. There's two big myths, I think, when you look at how to understand what happened with Tiananmen. One is that, as you say, they have very successfully sort of erased the issue from consciousness, right? Especially among younger Chinese. I have a lot of interns at CSIS who are PRC citizens, and when you ask them about it, they're not familiar with it, and so they've been very successful, I guess you could say, in that regard. At the same time, these information tools that exist now, were not there when they were trying to do this. Their ability to control is much more complicated. You'll hear from Chinese officials, we have to pay much more attention to public opinion than we have in the past. And I think that's very, very true. Now, of course, to some degree, in some areas, they've kind of stoked this themselves in terms of the nationalism and so on. And now occasionally it can be difficult for them to control. But I think this is a major, major issue going forward. And then I think the other one is how does the party focus on keeping this rising middle class on side, if you will. This is something, frankly, that they've done very, very effectively in the reform period. Probably the best example was in 2001 when the president at that time, Jiang Zemin, decided they would allow private entrepreneurs to join the party, right? That's quite a contradiction in terms. But I think there was a sense that this is a rising societal force. They have money, which is important. We can either bring them under the tent or we can have them operating outside of the tent and potentially be difficult. I think it's fair to say that after the Arab Spring, when they became very preoccupied with these sort of more diverse social stability threats, so something like an Arab Spring, they called it the Jasmine Revolution, they were very focused on this, right? And I think they took their eye off the ball of that rising middle class a little bit in terms of managing their expectations and interests. So one thing I'm watching with the new leadership is to see if we start to see policies that very much speak to that. And I think we will, because they're very knowledgeable about what's going on there. So, yeah.
Mr. Johnson,
Thank you very much for a very, very interesting presentation. I'd like to learn a little bit about what's going on in Asia pivot, one of the principal policy of Obama administration.
Yep.
In view of the recent Middle East turmoils, beginning by the Iraqi problems.
Sure. Well, a couple things. You'll know that the administration says rebalance now instead of pivot. So the term pivot was very controversial, I think, largely because, if you pivot towards something, you're pivoting away at the same time. And our European and Middle Eastern friends didn't like that very much. They had concerns. We're at a difficult stage, I think, with the rebalance right now. Generally how this works is a first administration comes up with the ideas, right, and the second administration implements them. And so there's a lot of wondering in the region, what is this thing going to look like? You've talked a lot about it. You've made some moves. We have Marines rotating through Darwin in Australia. There have been agreements now with the Philippines after the president's recent trip, and so on. So we're seeing some visible elements of it. And of course, interestingly, we just did every couple years we do a study at CSIS on Asian elites for the MacArthur Foundation. And we just completed it this year. It's available on our website if people are interested. And it's really quite interesting because across the region, the polling we got was most people were generally supportive of the rebalance. It was only in China, which kind of makes sense, that there was a perception that it was too targeted toward the Chinese. And I think this is an issue the administration needs to address. There's a strong perception in Asia, especially in China, that the rebalance is too heavily military. This comes back to the point that I was talking about earlier about economics, right? There needs to be an economic piece of this and a social piece and people to people. And, if you're going to make it real, it has to be very comprehensive. And this is where TPP becomes so important because, the administration has said that TPP is the economic fulcrum of the rebalance. So if you can't get TPP done, what does that say about the rebalance as a strategy? It's a real challenge going forward. So I think we're in kind of a stuck space, if you will, with the rebalance right now. Obviously, Iraq is a huge distraction. And this is the perception in the region that whenever a crisis or some bright, shiny object comes across the view of the U.S. government, they quickly turn toward that and forget about the rebalance. And I think in fairness to the administration, they've worked very hard. They've had a lot of senior officials give speeches where they say time and time and time again, we're serious about this. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. My personal view is they need to stop talking about it and start doing things, to demonstrate to the region that they're serious, right? And I think on the military and security side, a lot of the things we need to do with the rebalance really are not things you're going to announce publicly, right? Building more maritime domain awareness for the region, deepening the mill-mill relationship with the Chinese, I think, is a very important part of the rebalance policy. So we'll just see what they do. One of the challenges is that, unlike in the first Obama administration, there really is no guerrilla, if you will, at this very senior cabinet level running U.S. China relations, right? Mr. Donnellan, the national security advisor, played a big role. Certainly Secretary Clinton was very engaged on Asia policy. This hasn't really transitioned into the second administration. Fair or not, there's an impression that Secretary Kerry is very much absorbed by things in the Middle East. Jack Lew, the Treasury Secretary, is perceived as more of a domestic guy than sort of Geithner had history with China, that sort of thing. So there's just a sense that it's drifting at that cabinet level, and like in any system, if you can't deliver your general, if you're the working level guy and you can't deliver your general, it's hard to move the system, and get it to respond to you.
Just wait a second. Christopher Johnson, on behalf of us all, we want to thank you. I think this has really been an extraordinary tour de force about U.S.-China relations. I feel better about our government every time I hear a former government person like this speak, because I feel like it was great, huge depth of knowledge. We again want to thank Daisy Liu and ConocoPhillips. We have a very small token of our appreciation.
Thank you.
And we hope you'll come back again.
I'd be happy to anytime.
We'll read your stuff if it's published.
Sounds good.
CSIS.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.